This is Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi on the Tom Bigby River called Columbus. And sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is about the industrial pioneers Hale and Murdock and the Hale and Murdock Iron Works. Let's look into this fascinating world of Harrison Hale and Abraham Murdock, two entrepreneurs who transformed iron production in the antebellum and Civil War South. Our story kind of begins in the 1830s when Harrison Hale, born in 1807 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Abraham Murdock, who was born in 1810 in New Haven, Connecticut, found themselves on the way to Columbus, Mississippi. Now, we don't know if they met in New England or they met in Columbus proper, but they both came from very interesting backgrounds. Murdock's grandfather was a Continental Army patriot who owned a powder mill producing gunpowder for the Continental Army, while Hale would serve later in the Civil War as a Confederate Army lieutenant, and their mill or their furnace would actually produce armaments and ammunition for the Confederacy. Now, if I had good sound effects, I'd be inserting hammer beating on metal right here, but I don't. So let's just get right into what would be called the Iron Frontier. By the 1850s, Hale and Murdock had discovered something truly extraordinary. They found rich iron ore deposits in Alabama. Specifically, they found a specific type of ore in Lamar, Marion, and Fayette counties, with the most promising location about 25 miles from Columbus in Vernon, Alabama. The ore was remarkable. It ranged from pea size to boulder size, and it was of superior quality for that era for making pig iron. In 1854, they established their first significant operation, the Wilson's Creek Furnace, also known as Old Winston and Weston Furnace. They purchased approximately 50 acres covering 2 hills and began their iron-making enterprise with the ore they harvested from those hills. Their business model was pretty ingenious. They capitalized on 3 key advantages of that era: abundant, high-quality iron ore on location, nearby charcoal for fueling their furnace, and cheap slave labor. Now, by 1862, and the Civil War kicks off, their operation had expanded dramatically over the previous 10 years. Now they employed 150 men, mostly enslaved laborers, and began producing critical military supplies for the Confederacy. The Confederacy supplied them additional skilled labor to go with the enslaved labor so that they could manufacture small field ordnance. Of course, they were still producing domestic implements and plow points, but they were also creating instruments and utility type items for the military, including stirrups, iron buckles, which are not buckles like for clothing, but this is a specific type of item for wagons and moving cannon and arsenal. An interesting historical tidbit was that allegedly Nathan Bedford Forrest reportedly had his horses shod at their furnace on his way to the Battle of Shiloh. Don't know if that's true or not, but it is the local legend. After the Civil War and the end of slavery and the lack of rail infrastructure ultimately led to their downfall. Now, keep in mind, there never was any rail infrastructure for getting their product to market. They still managed to get their product to market, and their market was primarily Columbus, Mississippi. But the reason why they were forced in January of 1870 pretty much cease their operations was because they no longer had cheap enslaved labor. Their once multi-million-dollar properties were sold for just $450 to John W. Crowder and William P. Newman. While Hale's later life remains somewhat mysterious, we don't know a lot about what became of him or what he did, other than he went back to Columbus and continued to be a merchant. What that means, I'm not sure. But Murdock continued to be a very dynamic businessman. During the time of his ownership of the furnace and later, he had been an important member of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and was a member of their directorship, etc. And he then became president of that railroad. He also became the U.S. Vice Consul in Santa Rosa, Mexico, which was just over the border. And he was an investor in the Mississippi and San Rafael Mining Company. Tragically, Murdock died in 1888 at the Delch Hotel in Eagle Pass, Texas, while working as a director of the Cedar Silver Mines which was part of the Mississippi and San Rafael Mining Company's operations. And his body was shipped back to Columbus for burial at Friendship Cemetery. Hale and Murdock represent an interesting microcosm of Southern industrial ambition. They were innovative, their work was complex. They were ultimately constrained by the economic and social transformations of the time, i.e., the end of enslaved labor. But it's very interesting that these two gentlemen left the North, New England, and came south to take advantage of the cheap labor that existed in the South. This brings into question a lot of historical information. A lot of this information I've gleaned about these two gentlemen came from newspapers across the country. It came from documents in the courthouse, as well as documents in our public library, as well as census records. You too can do this. Nothing I'm doing is a great mystery. It's just good old-fashioned detective work. And I invite you to find out more about your community and your town. In the meantime, thank you for coming to my podcast, The Tombigbee Tales. Until next time.